This conference is being recorded. Only the main conference is recorded.
All right, good morning, everyone. Again, this is Padgett Fisher with Davidson Kuelthau. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your interest in this topic. We know you've got a lot of questions, and we hope to address all of them today. As you'll see there on the screen, we are handling questions via chat. That is a feature within Zoom, and as instructed there, if you just hover your cursor over the lower part of your screen, you should get a little toolbar that pops up. Select chat, and you can enter your questions there. Please direct your questions to Jim Kalny, and he will tee them up as our moderator today. All phone lines will remain muted for guests throughout this call. As you heard, we are recording this session, and we'll post it to our website after the program. I hope you enjoy today's discussion, and with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jim Kalny. Jim, go ahead.
Well, welcome, everyone. I'm hoping that this will be an informative day here today as we talk about FFCRA, and we talk about some of the issues that are confronting us as a result of the COVID-19 virus emergency. The title on the first day of FFCRA might be a little misleading. I am not going to sing the 12 Days of Christmas, so, but I did think that it was unique that the rhythm fits so nicely, so I couldn't resist doing that. I want to welcome you all here, and I want to tell you that my name's Jim Kalny. I am a shareholder with Davidson Kuelthau. Also with me on the call is Abby Busler. She's an associate who's been putting a lot of time into these issues, and in fact has already given a couple webinars and issued many articles having to do with COVID-19, particularly in schools, otherwise affecting the public sector. Also with me on the call is Tony Steffek, shareholder in our labor and employment team, who I know has worked with several of those of you who are on the call. So with that, I'd like to start talking about what our agenda is for today, and it's very aggressive. We'd like to try to answer your questions and hope to be able to get there. But I've got to say we have a lot to cover, so let's kind of get to it here. Family First Coronavirus Response Act, the FFCRA, has a number of different things we'll be talking about today, but in general, what we want to do is, first of all, clarify some issues that have been coming up for employees having to do with the relationship between Executive Order 12, that's the Safer at Home Act, and the FFCRA. That's one of the things that will be a little bit of a theme as we go through the first part of this presentation. We're going to talk about the two types of leave that are created by FFCRA. That's the paid sick leave and the emergency extended FMLA. We're also going to touch on emergency responders, and that's one area where we'll be contrasting with the Safer at Home Act a bit and explaining how they relate or actually don't relate much. The emergency declaration orders and related issues, many of you have issued emergency orders. We're going to talk a little bit about their scope and effect. Then we're going to get into compensation options during the emergency. In many cases, the fact is the municipalities are looking at this act with a different viewpoint than businesses. Unfortunately, some businesses are looking at this, and this may force them out of business. Some of the leaves that we're going to be talking about may not be usable because people are going to be laid off because there won't be work for them to perform under the Act. Governments are a little different. Many of our functions are essential, as we will discuss, and when this is all over, chances are very good we will all be back. All the employees will be back. So a little bit different view on it. We also have budgeted for payment throughout the year, so might be a little bit different issue than is confronting many businesses. We're also going to talk about open meetings issues, particularly focusing on how to do remote meetings. And last but not least, we're going to dive into the issue on elections. With the election coming up right in the middle of the Safer at Home Act, there are certainly some safety concerns and procedures that we need to address. So let's start by talking about the FFCRA and the Stay at Home Act. FFCRA creates two new types of leave. They're reimbursable by tax credit, but that's expressly in the statute, not applicable to the public sector. We're not in a position where we can get the tax credits. It does, however, appear that there may be a little bit of relief in that the current law does not subject payments made under FFCRA to FICA or withholding. That doesn't seem consistent with the rest of the law, and it makes us a little leery to make that representation, but right now that's the way the law is written expressly. The SAH, Stay at Home Act, is a very different type of legislation. It declares essential government functions during the COVID-19 emergencies and business functions. And basically what it does is it restricts and conditions movements during the emergency, and then provides sanctions for violations, a very different kind of act than one creating benefits. This says who can go to work, what people can do, and limits their movement. They're both caused by the virus, but as we'll see as we go along, other than that, there might not be that much of a relationship to them. Okay, covered employers under FFCRA. First of all, there's two different types of benefit. There's the Paid Sick Leave Act, in the case of emergency or any other. In that case, what applies is any employer who employs more than one employee. The Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act will apply. The Emergency Family and Medical Leave Act applies the way the Family and Medical Leave Act, the original one, originally applied with regard to the public sector. The way the law was drafted was in the private sector, the employers with 500 or less only were those that were included in the modification to the definition of covered employer. That, however, does not apply to us. The Family Medical Leave always has included public agency in its definition. That's provided in Section 3X of the Fair Labor Standards Act. That was not changed when the other modifications to covered employers was inserted into the Act. Okay. As I said before, it's good to think of the benefits under FFCRA as two categories. One is a 2-week leave it's paid sick leave. It's calculated at the employee's regular rate of pay, where the employee is unable to work or telework. We'll talk about that a little bit. It's any work or telework, because the employee is, number one, this is the first three categories within the Paid Sick Leave Act. One, subject to federal, state, or local quarantine or isolation order related to COVID-19. We'll talk in more detail about exactly what that means. Secondly, has been advised by a healthcare provider to self-quarantine related to COVID-19. Now, that's one provision that we'll talk about a little bit later that might be useful to employees who are concerned about contracting the disease and maybe in the vulnerable or high-risk categories, and or is experiencing COVID-19 symptoms and seeking a medical diagnosis. In our view, those three really apply to people who are exhibiting, this is related to COVID-19, having symptoms of that disease. And as we'll see, that is important to the interpretation of how you apply those. The benefit for this first category of paid sick leave is up to $515 per day, up to a maximum of $5,110 in the aggregate. The other category is payable at 2/3 of the employee's regular rate. That is, again, where an employee is not able to work or telework because the employee, one, is caring for an individual subject to a local government quarantine or isolation order, or who has been advised by a healthcare provider to self-quarantine. Two, caring for a child whose school or place of care is closed. Or three, is experiencing any other substantially similar condition specified by the Health or Human Services Department. So this type of leave obviously is paid differently. The benefit is up to $200 per day, $2,000 in the aggregate. As far as calculating the rate is calculated in the same manner you would be applying for Fair Labor Standards Act calculations to determine overtime and so forth. The same rules apply out of that act. A part-time employee is also entitled to leave for his average number of work hours in a 2-week period. So in certain circumstances, that might be a little bit difficult to calculate. Same way that we would calculate it, however, for employees under the Fair Labor Standards Act. You use the number of hours the employees normally schedule to work. If the employee's schedule varies, you use an average, 6-month average. Now, one of the things we wanted to zero in on and address is quarantine or isolation. Under the FFCRA, in fact, under the Paid Sick Leave Act, if you recall, the first type, actually the first qualification, relates to if a person is quarantined or isolated or under an isolation order. As I mentioned, as I first went through those qualifications, the specific individual is being compelled by a government entity to remain at home. It's because they're known to be sick or suspected to be sick under those first three. This is not the safer at home mandate, which is just, as I said before, really a prophylactic that protects. It's very general in nature. In fact, it really doesn't prohibit people from movement. People are allowed to move. It isn't an isolation order in that respect. In other words, it does not appear the Safer at Home Act made the ESLA, the paid sick leave benefit, automatically available. you still have to plug into one of the specific 6 categories that we discussed above. This seems to be supported by some guidance in the DOL, which talks about business closures and references that they apply, business closures apply even if the employer is closing because of a directive, a state or federal directive or order. Now, Tony, I know that you have been involved in some discussions on this issue. In fact, at the Labor and Employment section of the State Bar, there's been some discussion on this. Would you like to kind of fill us in your insight on this matter?
Yeah, absolutely, Jim, and thanks for pitching it on over, and thanks everybody for joining us today. Jim, I think you hit it pretty much on the head. There is a lot of difference of opinion out there about whether stay-at-home order is a quarantine order, and quite frankly, there's a lot of attorneys putting out publication pieces out there saying, well, you know, because you're ordered to stay at home, that this qualifies. We don't see it that way. We see it, as Jim explained, that it is more of a direct, you know, for example, you know, let's say that things down in the city of Milwaukee get even worse, where there's some sort of government order saying that regardless of what you do, you have to stay at home for 2 weeks, or an order says that, you know, if you were exposed, you have to stay at home for 2 weeks and you can't go to the grocery store, you can't go to the gas station, things like that, then yeah, you're probably qualified. But just the pure stay-at-home order, Jim was exactly right in that it doesn't force you into a bubble to stay away from people. You can still move about. It's just we want you to stay at home. So to the extent you're seeing different opinions out there about whether this the stay-at-home order automatically qualifies people, we'd ask that you really dig into that, and to the extent you want to call us for some more guidance, we're happy to give it. But we don't feel that that the stay-at-home order basically just gets everybody in as a free pass for the 2 weeks of paid sick leave.
Okay, moving on.
Pass it back to you, Jim.
Thank you. More comments about the Paid Sick Leave Act. Again, there's 2 categories of benefits, and they may be mixed. For example, you might have be at home originally for taking care of your children, and then later contract the disease, which would be a different reason for asking for the 2 weeks of paid sick leave. It is 2 weeks. You don't get to stack this leave. You don't get to take it for different reasons. Have 2 weeks because you contracted the disease and 2 weeks because you're taking care of your kids. It's all, the benefit is a 2 week total. It's intended to dovetail with the Extended Family Medical Leave Act. The first 2 weeks of the Family Medical Leave Act extension is not covered, other than by saying you can take any other type of paid leave if you wish. You can substitute that. So the last 10 weeks of the 12 weeks you would be eligible for under Family and Medical Leave Act would pick up at that point. Yes, the ESPLA has an interesting provision that talks about caring for an individual as opposed to just a son or daughter. One of the differences you'll see if you look at the text of the Act is that the FMLA, the extended FMLA, deals with care for a son or daughter. The Paid Sick Leave Act talks in terms of care of an individual, which seems to be broader. Abby, have you had a chance to look at that issue at all?
Hi, yes, Jim. I did take a look into that, and it's interesting because they definitely chose that term individual to be quite broad. And likely include, a spouse, a significant non-married significant other, a domestic partner, even a roommate. But I think the important thing is to keep in mind that this care for an individual really is still narrow in the fact that you're caring for someone that you're in, that stay-at-home order with. It's not you leaving your household, driving down the street and caring for your grandmother who is not in isolation with you. It's really meant to focus on that group of people that's within your household. And it says individual to help not just limit it to family members. So, for those individuals who might have multiple non-relative roommates, you would be able to care for your roommate. But from everything that I've seen in the guidance that I've read, it was use the term individual, not so that it would spread throughout. You could go help your neighbor across the street or anyone like that, but really focus on those individuals within your household during this time.
Okay, thanks, Ab. One thing we'll talk about a little bit later in the outline is documentation for leaves. Now, obviously in the public sector, as I mentioned before, we're not going to be documenting for tax credits, but we are making a record of why the leave was taken. Again, I'll address that in a little bit. And of course, we should be documenting for FEMA purposes, whatever costs we're experiencing as a result of the impact of the COVID-19 emergency, and record those expenses in the hopes that we can get them recompensed in the future. Another comment I wanted to make on the extended family medical leave. An employee who can't work because they're caring for a child whose school or place or provider is unavailable, that person's entitled to up to 12 weeks of paid leave. Touched on this earlier. The initial 2 weeks of paid leave could be covered under the Paid Sick Leave Act, with the additional 10 weeks covered under the Extended Emergency Medical Leave Act. That's certainly one way these two acts fit together. Again, the pay for care of a child is at 2/3 rate of regular rate, up to the $200. Now, telework is one of the things that is heavily dealt with in the Act. And in fact, one thing that you have to realize is that people who can telework have to be paid their normal wages, and the telework is not compensated under paid leave. If the people can work, you can't do the FFCRA leave, very simply. Next. Other telework issues are out there, though, and you should review your policies and think about them a little bit. If a person can telework, of course, you're going to have to compensate for the work performed. Now, state law, though, requires that our non-exempt employees track their work and their work start times, meal times, breaks, etc., in the same way that you would be tracking them if people were coming into work. So we need to brush up our policies, make sure we have things clear, periodic call-ins to see if work's available and so forth. Very likely are covered as compensable time. So you need to have your rules clear. Non-exempt employees, of course, have to be paid overtime. So those extra calls might cause overtime if we're not careful about the policies and procedures we're going to have for checking into telework, ending telework, and when you're not expected to call in. Documentation I wanted to talk about. the IRS very recently put out some rules on this. For the paid sick leave or the EFMLEA, the employee must file a written request for that leave under the IRS provisions. It has to have the employee's name, dates of the leave, but it also has to have a written statement giving the reason for the leave and discussing, and if you look further at the regs, they talk about some detail about why the person qualifies for the particular leave. That can include a statement of what school the kid is, for example, if it's child care leave, what school has been closed, what provider is no longer available, the name of the child, the age of the child. Those types of things can be required for documentation. A statement why the employee cannot work also should be in your documentation. Why can't I telework? What's the nature of the job? And a description in particular of what the leave is expected to entail. Now, if the leave is based on self-quarantine, there's also some specific guidance there that the name and entity of the healthcare provider ordering or advising the quarantine. And if the employee is quarantined for the care of another, the name and relationship of the person being cared for. You can require documentation on all that. That means you can ask questions about all that. Of course, staying away from asking questions about specific diagnosis. You don't want to get into a medical examination, but you do want and have the right to knowing the reasons for why people are taking the leave and a good explanation of the leave. I like this idea because it kind of legitimizes it. It makes sure that we have a good record for the public, if they're ever interested, of why people took leave, and it provides for a legitimacy of it. The employee signs off on this is why I need to take the leave. So in any case, that documentation is clearly provided for. Emergency responders. I'm going to be turning this over to Tony in just a bit, but I want to talk a little bit about emergency responders under the FFCRA. The definition is spelled out, and there's a long list. You'll see it in the next slide. An employee who's necessary for the provision of transport care, health care, comfort, and nutrition of patients who are otherwise needed to limit the spread of the COVID-19. Those people can be exempt from FFCRA. Now, why would you exempt an employee? That puts them in a position where they can't take advantage of all the provisions of the Act, including in particular the child care provisions, I believe. Obviously, I have to question whether you'd want someone coming to work if we knew they were infected under the Paid Sick Leave Act. But if a person is using a person who is exempt from the Act would not be able to use the family care of others portions of the Act if they were exempt from the Act. And as you can see, the exemptions aren't really surprising. Military, National Guard, law enforcement officers, firefighters. In fact, we should probably talk about firefighters a little bit. Emergency medical personnel. 911 operators have received a lot of attention. For those of you who would be interested in that, they are expressly included. It's interesting, there's a note in the provision that of the DOL regs regarding emergency responders that says, try to use it sparingly. We want to do what we can to limit the spread of the disease. So they kind of give us this exemption and tell us to be careful about using it. Kind of interesting. In regard to firefighters, one interesting issue keeps coming up. And Tony, you and I think, let's try to take a tackle at this one. Sure. Paid on call firefighters. As I look at the act, believe it or not, I think this is one of those unintended consequences. I think paid on call firefighters may be qualified for the act. As I mentioned before, when they put FFCRA in place, particularly the Family and Medical Leave Act portion of the act in place, what they did is they modified the definition of what is a covered employer. And in many cases, and they changed the rule with regard to covered employees as well. And they substituted for the old rule, which was, what was it, $12.50 in the past year, working for the employer for that period of time. They substituted for a 30-day provision, apparently to make this available to more people. Well, it just says 30 days. It doesn't say how many hours have to be worked in the 30 days. So to the extent that paid on call firefighters could be considered employees, it seems the law might apply. I don't know. What do you think of that, Tony?
I think you're right, Cal. I think yeah. You use the example of the volunteer firefighter who puts in, 5 hours a month, but it's, 5 different days and they're always on call and so on and so forth. Yeah, I think for purposes of this, that, as long as they've basically been a volunteer firefighter for at least 30 days, they probably qualify. But then, it turns to the next question of the analysis, which Jim and I talked about earlier today, is, okay, well, even if they qualify though, do we have to give them the leave because are they an emergency responder, right? And so to me, it's, if your main source of firefighting or EMT services is the volunteers and on call, I would argue that they are eligible for the leave anyway because of their status. Do you agree, Jim?
Yeah. And the other thing is you can exempt them.
Right,
Simply
exactly.
exempt them. And then we don't have the issue that you have to deal with. Because there's other issues. I mean, calculating the regular rate, I don't think the Act originally contemplated calculating the regular rate for emergency personnel. So
yeah, no, I think you're right.
Paid on call.
Right.
Now, of course, if you're in a department where you have part-time firefighters, that's a different story. If you don't exempt them, they're part-time employees and they're entitled to relief under the Act. So I guess with that issue, I'm going to pass it on to Tony to start talking about exempt workers and the Stay-at-Home Act.
Sure, and thanks, Cal. And before I get into that, there's one other thing that I wanted to touch before I forget. We'd gotten some questions over the wire during the webinar today about the extended family medical leave and teleworking and taking care of the kids, which is going to be an issue that we all talk about a lot. But just as an update, sometime late last night, the IRS issued some guidance about the paperwork that you need to do to fill out in order to claim the exemption. Now, I know that that's a little bit of a different scenario for you all in the municipal sector, but one of the interesting things I thought came out of that was that guidance specifically said that 2 spouses or 2 parents both cannot claim the extended family and medical leave, 2/3 pay leave. And we had been running into that quite a bit. I'd had several clients ask questions of, hey, we employ both the mom and the dad. And what do we do if both of them request the leave? Well, I think, and I haven't been in the weeds of the guidance that was issued last night, but I think that issue is taken care of now from the IRS, and they've basically put forward a position that says, no, only one of you can, with a straight face, legitimately claim that you can't work or telework because you got to take care of the kids. Almost acknowledging that, no, it's, while we all might think parenting at all times is a 2-person job, under these laws, we're not going to do that. In addition, one of the other things that the guidance talked about was, what do you do with high school age kids or older kids who seemingly are self-sufficient during the day. And the guidance there, and Abby or Jim, if you've read it differently, the guidance there was you've got to have some pretty good reasons as to why your 16-year-old needs you to be there at all times and you can't telework. So those are things to just kind of watch, and I wanted to make sure I brought them up before I, quite frankly, moved on to the other stuff and forgot. So Jim and Abby, is that your interpretation of what just came out yesterday, to the extent you've looked?
Yeah, Tony. Yeah, that's exactly what I've seen. And I think it's really important that they touched on the, under 18, but, usually those children who are old enough to kind of be on their own a little bit and don't need that complete parent supervision like a 16-year-old.
Right. You'd have to really explain why all of a sudden this summer you need to be there watching them all the time when all the prior summers you worked and they were home alone. So just something to watch out for. So moving on then, getting back to what we were talking about. So we've got the emergency responder issue under the DOL guidance, but then we also have Governor Evers' stay-at-home order where he specifically talks about okay, we've got the stay-at-home order, but these are the types of employees that wouldn't apply, that we're basically kind of expecting you to keep coming to work. And you'll see on the next slide, the slide that's up right now, is that the order listed specific employees where they are going to be exempt from the stay-at-home order. And you'll see in the first bullet point, paid or volunteer first responders, just like we just talked about, your paid or volunteer firefighters, that they would be exempt. These types of employees would not have the ability to come in and say, well, the stay-at-home order says that I'm supposed to be working remotely and I want to do that. No, that's not exactly how it goes. We have highlighted in the slides their building inspectors. That's an important one, and one that doesn't immediately come to mind, like perhaps police or firefighters or EMTs do. Building inspectors are still going to be important during these months because this is a safety thing beyond the safety concerns we have with regard to coronavirus, and we need the building inspectors to still be on top of issues that are happening with regard to structures and buildings in your communities, particularly extra so in light of the fact that everybody's in these buildings all the time. A lot of people are at home, and we need to make sure that they're safe. There will be
and another thing and Tony, excuse me for a second, another thing interesting about building inspectors, there's kind of an underlying current in the Safer at Home Act that we want to keep certain businesses moving. One of them is the construction industry. So building inspectors are named as people who are essential to go out there and do inspections. Not only just safety inspections, but also inspections that will help that essential construction industry to continue moving.
Yeah, great, Jim. Thank you. That's a great point. Yeah, because we forget though that there are segments of industry where the stay-at-home order does, like Jim said, has that undertone of we want these things to keep going during this time and keep plugging away. And that's why, if there's a construction site in your municipality, if there's something else that needs to be watched over, that you can still have the people doing that watching fully on staff. So those are the exempt workers. Now you will have other workers that might not be what I would call essential, like a first responder, dispatcher, child welfare, so on and so forth. The stay-at-home order does allow, though, that certain employees can work to maintain minimum basic operations, which is in the third bullet point down. This is, let's say you've got, park and rec employees aren't doing a whole lot right now, and perhaps they're not deemed essential. Now, that's not to say that all park and rec employees, have to be kept out of the workplace. You still can have people working a minimum amount just to make sure that, like we've got underlined, the value of the business's inventory to preserve the condition of the plant and equipment, ensure security. You can still have somebody from your park and rec department, for example, going around and making sure that parks aren't being vandalized and making sure that, you know, we're not quite out of the freezing temperatures yet, that all of your physical buildings are safe and secure, that there's no damage, so on and so forth. So you can have people doing that during this time. You can also have these people working outside of their homes if it's necessary to make sure that those who are working remotely are able to do so. You know, I know that IT personnel has been designated as an exempt as an exempt worker, but your in-house IT person can be working to make sure that all your systems are supported, so on and so forth. The key, though, is to make sure that employees who are working still maintain kind of the common sense social distancing issues that we've been talking about. You know, only have one of them in a space at one time if that's safe and secure. You know, keep insisting on washing hands and maintaining distance and so on and so forth. So turning then to the next slide, the specific language of the stay-at-home order defines essential governmental functions as all services provided by the state, tribal, or local governments needed to ensure the continuing operation of the government body. It is your job as the municipality and the local government to get together and determine which of your governmental functions are truly essential under the order, and then to take the next step to determine which of your employees or outside folks are necessary to make sure that these functions are properly performed. To the extent your municipality hasn't already, that's something that really should be done soon to make sure that that you're in compliance with the order. Now, there are lots of arguments to be made about who is essential and who is not. There are lots of different ways to loop in people as essential, particularly with the fact that, yeah, we're on April 1st, but we're not out of the snow season theoretically yet. So some public works employees that maybe ordinarily you'd say, well, that's not totally essential right now. If they are one of the employees that would be called in to do snow plowing services, or if there's a water main break to respond to that, there are arguments to be made that these employees are essential. So that's something that you're going to have to sit down with your governing body and decide. So the question becomes, we're talking about essential employees and that you don't have to provide, you know, they might be exempt from the stay-at-home order, they might be exempt from FFCRA. What do we do, though, if one of these essential employees contracts coronavirus? Right? We certainly, as Jim mentioned before, we don't want those people coming into work and getting everybody else sick. Plus, we want them to focus on themselves and get better. But under the law, this newly created legal leave isn't available. So what are some of the options that you can do for these folks? Obviously, if they have regular sick leave or PTO or other paid leave, that can be used to fill the gap while they're sick. The key is for those folks to understand, though, that, you know, as they're burning the sick leave or vacation time, it is going away, and once they're better and the world rights itself again, that they won't have those leave banks. Depending on the size of your community and how many employees you have, you might be subject to, really, you know, we can go back on the size, but there is regular FMLA that can be used. Certainly, contracting coronavirus would constitute a serious health condition that would qualify for somebody for unpaid FMLA. And there's really no doubt about that. And then this third bullet point we have here is what various municipalities that we work with have been doing is creating a separate and temporary paid sick leave policy that just applies to coronavirus. So in addition to your regular sick leave policy, some of the employers are creating this side bank, and usually it has the same eligibility as does the FFCRA leave. You know, you've come down with the virus, you've been exposed to the virus, you have to take care of a family member, and you are you would be setting up an entirely separate policy with separate policy language that would make this leave available under these circumstances. What you're going to want to do, though, from a legal perspective, if you do this, is you want to make sure that your language is very, very precise as to who would be eligible for this additional leave, right? If the goal is to have this additional leave bank available to those employees who would otherwise be exempt or not covered by the FFCRA, you would want to specify that. If you don't specify that, basically you could be creating an additional 2 weeks of paid leave on top of the FFCRA leave that might be available to your non-essential employees. Maybe you want to do that. That might be, that might be something that would intentionally be done. But if you don't limit it, then you might have other employees who say, okay, I need to take 2 weeks for FFCRA leave. And then after that 2 weeks, well, now I need an additional 2 weeks to take care of somebody else. And by the way, now I'm going to access this additional sick leave that you created. And now they're getting paid for, up to a month or 160 hours of time. And that can get real expensive real fast. So it's just something to pay attention to. Jim or Abby, before I move on to non-essential employees, is there anything you'd like to add with regard to that topic?
Well, we kind of hit essential but uninfected later. So at this point, no. Probably in a little bit, I'll have something to add.
Okay, sounds good. Well, then we will
Tony,
oh, go ahead, Abby.
I was going to say we have one question about a little bit of clarification with FFCRA. Does FFCRA apply to emergency responders unless the employer identifies them as being emergency and needed?
Jim, you're kind of our guru on that, so I'll let you take that one.
I think that's a valid point, though. The FFCRA actually says these are exempted, are employees who are exempt from the application of the Act categorically. So those people are not entitled to leave under that Act.
Right. So based on that, with the question being basically that they're only exempt if you take that additional step to specifically identify them. No, the Act does that for you, right? The Act has automatically made them exempt from the Act.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I believe I would still designate them because I'm not, it does say these are, it says in the Act who's exempt. It says in the regs, it lists the people who are exempt. Mm-hmm. But I think you still want to designate them to make sure your bases are covered as you go through and you're talking about who are your essential employees.
Yes, and that's kind of what I was thinking too, belt and suspenders type approach. The FFCRA says this, but from the purposes of the stay-at-home order, if you're already designating your essential employees, you might as well designate them. And that way there's no ambiguity about whether this would apply. So that's a great question though, because it is, it is an interesting issue. And Abby, thanks for bringing that up. Okay. Moving on, now we're talking about non-essential employees. So certain employees may be deemed non-essential under the Safer at Home order, and as a government employer, that would equally apply to you. And the question becomes, what can we do with them during this period? We've got our staff here. They're deemed non-essential, so we can't have them coming in, but they're great employees, and we want to make sure they're taken care of. Or, hey, we know that eventually we're going to have to reopen and we're going to need these people, and it could be on a moment's notice. So what are we going to do to make sure that when business reopens as usual, business reopens as usual, we can get right back to work right away? So one of the options is you can have some folks work remotely or telework. Just because they're deemed a non-essential employee under the Safer at Home order doesn't mean that you can't have them work remotely. It's just they have to stay home and they have to stay away. So that's something that you can do, keep people working. But obviously, for many of you, that's not necessarily an option depending on the circumstance. And the example that I always use in what we're about to talk about is, let's say that you have somebody who's like director of recreational activities, that their general job is to run the softball league and all the other park programs that you've got. And clearly all of that's gonna, it's non-essential. You know, kids by law can't get together in groups and play organized sports or whatnot. But this is a really good employee, and once we get back to normal, we're gonna want that employee around. So that way, when people can get back out there and start interacting with each other, we wanna provide them with options. So the question is, with this recreational director, what do we do? And you know, the basic idea there would be to temporarily cease their employment until the non-essential ban is lifted. And there are two primary ways to do that. And I'm just flipping through. So the first way is, if you want to keep them full and paid, now you can continue to pay them depending on what you decide. You can allow access to your sick leave banks that maybe under the normal policy wouldn't be available, like they're not sick. You can create another supplemental leave bank that people can tap into. Continuing to pay them during the emergency. This is interesting. I don't believe we have any, at least the last roster I saw, I don't know if we have any school people here, but Jim and I yesterday were talking about a proposed bill in the Wisconsin legislature that would statutorily require schools to keep everybody employed during this period. I don't know where that's going, but that's just a, you know, if the law says you have to keep them on, you have to keep them on. So you can figure out ways to pay them, but I don't know that that's always going to be naturally feasible. Plus, as governmental employees, you have the issue of you know, perspective, and if you have private community that are closing and laying people off, you got to think about what's the appearance going to be if we have non-essential employees who we're just keeping on the payroll for now, and we don't have any work for them to do. So all that has to factor in your decision. And one thing that you could potentially do is temporarily end the employee's responsibility to come into work. And two ways to do that are through layoff and furlough. Starting with layoff really is just a softer way of saying termination of employment. You know, whether you call it a termination, a firing, a layoff, the formal employment relationship between you and the employee ends if you lay somebody off. Another thing to think about with layoffs is sometimes there's a perception that if you lay somebody off, you have an obligation to bring them back when business resumes. That's not necessarily the case. Now, you could potentially, well, not so much anymore, you know, have certain collective bargaining agreements, but that doesn't really apply anymore. So if you lay somebody off, you have no obligation to bring them back. Some of the positives of structuring it as a layoff is that the employee can go seek unemployment, which you're not a guarantor of, but you won't get in their way. And if they're laid off, then your obligation to continue providing insurance benefits would end. So healthcare, you'd have to make the, you know, COBRA where applicable available, but you wouldn't have to, you know, continually be paying it. They're not on your payroll anymore. The biggest negative that I see under a layoff is that you really do lose any control that you might otherwise have over that employee. So if you lay somebody off and they're no longer employed, and then all of a sudden there's a water main break or a huge snow event where you'd love to be able to call that employee and say, hey, yeah, I get it, it's 2 in the morning, but we've got a snow event, we need you to come in. Once they're laid off, there is absolutely no obligation for them to come in and do that. So you might be left with not enough employees to take care of the situation. So the flip side of that is you can potentially furlough the employee. And basically what a furlough is it's an involuntary forced unpaid leave by your employee. Your employee still works for you. They're still on the payroll. It's just you're telling them to go home. We don't have work for you to do right now. So we don't want you to come into work and we're not going to pay you. If you have, but the benefit of this, I'm going to kind of skip down a couple bullet points, is if for a furloughed employee, you could still have control over the employee. Like, okay, you're furloughed, we don't want you to come in, but if we do get a snow emergency, we're going to call and we would expect you to report within, an hour or whatever it is. And that can be a term and condition of the continued employment, which gives you that control to handle emergencies as they arise. The con of that, though, is that they're still on your payroll. You'd still have the obligation to pay for insurance and everything that goes along with that. Now, if the insurance cost is not as severe as the potential of being left without employees, then that's potentially the decision that you have to make. Just because an employee is furloughed doesn't mean that they're automatically ineligible for unemployment. An employee can seek unemployment for reduced work hours. It is as long as they're, I just looked at this, as long as the employee doesn't work more than, I believe, 16 hours a week, then they would still be eligible for unemployment. So if you have somebody where you just need them to come in for 8 hours one day, that wouldn't DQ them from collecting unemployment. Getting to bullet points 2 and number 3 real quick. If they're on call or otherwise working and they're not exempt, you've got to control the hours. You have to make sure that they're booking their hours and you're paying them for them. Interestingly, if any of those employees are exempt, if they work any portion of a week, you have to pay them for that entire work week, absent certain circumstances. That's an important thing to watch out for, because if you call in somebody for a day and they're a salaried employee, you might have to pay them for the whole week. What we've been advising several clients to do in that regard is temporarily switch your exempt employees to hourly employees during this period. Just because somebody can receive a salary and is exempt doesn't mean that you have to do that. And an easy solution to this is to control costs, is just temporarily pay them an hourly rate instead of a salary and ask them to log all of their hours. So with that, and paying attention to time, I'm going to turn it over to Abby. Are you taking over right now for unemployment comp under the CARES Act?
Yes, I can do that. Sorry, I had myself muted so you didn't hear my background noise there.
No problem.
I have to do an emergency interruption. I'm not exactly sure who it was, but somebody said that the list of emergency responders means they are emergency responders and not eligible under FFCRA. Whoever said that was in error. I'm pretty sure it was me. Whoever said that was an error. The law does specifically provide that an employer of an employee who is a healthcare provider or an emergency responder may elect to exclude such employee from the application of the provisions of the amendment under FFCRA. So the proper response is that you can elect people in and out. You can elect emergency responders. Yeah. So I have to apologize for my misstatement. I know there was a lot of debate about electing to have telecommunicators as emergency responders, as I mentioned as I was going through. And that's why I decided I better double check it. And yes, in fact, we can elect to exclude them. That way you could give those people the benefit if you wish to.
Oh, very interesting.
That is an excellent interruption. Yes, awesome. Yeah, so turning it over to unemployment compensation with the new CARES Act. The new CARES Act has expanded unemployment compensation. Unfortunately, there are not any regulations out yet addressing this, but I also want to keep in mind that, Wisconsin is allowing, as Tony mentioned earlier, that yes, employees who have their hours reduced can receive a partial unemployment compensation payment. So that's definitely an option for some of those employees. The new CARES Act has a maximum 39-week coverage, and it would allow for that individual to receive their normal amounts of unemployment under the state, plus an extra $600 per week. So that's a pretty big difference here, and that was one of the main purposes of this CARES Act, was to provide additional unemployment benefits because of the significant amount of individuals who are unemployed at this moment and will likely continue to be unemployed. If you've looked at Wisconsin's Department of Workforce Development website lately, you will see that they have a big warning on there saying that they are still working to coordinate its system with the new CARES Act law. So we will keep you updated as to any future guidance that Wisconsin plus the federal government will provide, but just wanted to give you a little heads up as to what was recently passed with the CARES Act and unemployment compensation. And then, Tony, were you handling emergency declaration, or would you like, or?
I thought you were, but I could be wrong.
Okay, I'm happy to jump in, sorry.
All right.
So obviously a lot of you guys have been either contemplating or putting into order an emergency declaration pursuant to with that 32311, a local government can declare by order either an ordinance or a resolution that there is an emergency that impairs that transportation, food, fuel supplies, etc., and other critical systems. The important thing to keep in mind when you're doing an emergency declaration, though, is to state the cause of emergency. Obviously, it's the COVID-19. It's a federal emergency as declared by the federal government. It has been declared a state emergency, and then with your local government emergency declaration, you're declaring that it is also a local government emergency. And you would list any board rules that would be suspended at that time. You're listing the specific timeline for that emergency period, and then any fines for violations of that emergency declaration. The scope, any of the extent of the emergency declaration, because of this emergency declaration, the governing body won't always meet promptly. So you're providing that extra executive action for those individuals to take. Typically, that could be a mayor and a city administrator working together to kind of balance each other out. And all of those decisions have some type of nexus to the emergency going on. And I think one last point that's important to make here is that last bullet point where all of these actions are valid and binding as if it was performed within the normal limits of that municipality. So all of that action is binding on that municipality. Did Tony or Jim have anything to add on that emergency declaration?
Yeah, I think the important thing to consider when you're doing the emergency declarations and when you consider the effect of them is the act that we're acting under was probably designed to deal with things like floods and other issues where there might be an interruption in traffic. At least that's the history we've had. This is kind of a new application for those emergency powers. That being said, the powers that are granted are pretty broad. And I think as long as you maintain any action under those policies to make sure that they have a nexus to the emergency, you're in pretty good shape to be able to carry them out. As Abby mentioned, in some cases you have emergency declarations also have a penalty provision. If there's a penalty provision for villages in particular, you got to make sure you have properly published that declaration as provided by the state law. So there's a few little nuances, but one other thing, as mentioned, the executive action, don't forget, the executive should not forget to get those actions ratified. It's important that the emergency declaration itself should be done by ordinance or resolution, and that the executive power by statute specifically is supposed to be brought to the body as soon as the body can meet.
Yeah, so jumping in and keeping in mind that I know we're running a little close on time, I just wanted to touch on remote meetings. Obviously, right now there is that ability to meet remotely. Open meetings law does allow a municipality to meet either via telephone conference call, a virtual Zoom meeting. Those are acceptable, but importantly, it's making sure that the public have some type of way to either monitor and participate in that meeting. If it's, allowing a separate line for the public to call in and ask their questions or submit their questions ahead of time or afterwards. It's really just making sure that the public is still able to participate remotely. And this was specifically mentioned in the stay-at-home order, and we have the links right there to both of those advisories. And something important too to consider is while there doesn't have to be a central meeting place, there could be. You could have, a central meeting place that is accessible to the public, where you would have a place for the public to come to for someone who, doesn't have a telephone or doesn't have internet access or is unable to. But, it's those accommodations are made to facilitate that reasonable access, but also keeping in mind that given the present circumstances with COVID-19 being the issue here and encouraging those social distances, making sure that it is reasonably accessible, but also safe for those members of the public and also for the individuals who are required at the meetings, making sure that it's accessible, but not putting anyone at more of a risk than they need to be. And going into that with the mass gatherings at meetings, one of the Governor Evers' emergency orders prohibited mass gatherings of 10 or more individuals. While governments are specifically exempted from this, they are still encouraged to practice that social distancing with meetings in person. That means, placing the chairs at least 6 feet apart, not having too many people in the room at the same time. Those are all different considerations to have. And I have seen it as well where meetings have been held completely remote with no individuals at a common center place to really avoid any unnecessary exposure. I'm not sure if Tony or Jim would like to add anything on that.
Yeah, just to kind of recap, one of the issues that keeps coming up in this matter is whether you can have an entirely remote meeting. And it's a very reasonable interpretation that you can. The only problem is there's also language talking about the use of people that might not have the use of a telephone or some way of viewing or listening in on the meeting. That is the only thing that suggests that there should be a central meeting site, someplace where the people can go and see the meeting, maybe participate in the meeting. That being said, there's also a very strong prevalence right now of not gathering people when possible. And it does seem that the AG's office is given leeway here and saying we're going to let you do something entirely remote, entirely virtual, without having an actual meeting place, at least during the time of the emergency. I'd be very careful to make sure we limit it to the time of the emergency. Hopefully we'll be meeting again in person soon. But there does seem to be that leeway out there. Arguably, it's more compliant with the law to have a central place where people can come and listen in, but practically, I don't believe a DA, and it doesn't seem the AG will go after anybody who hasn't open meetings and does everything they can to allow people to listen in and do it entirely remotely.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Jim, that, you know, these practices are there for, you know, the short time of this emergency, and not that every single meeting in the future will be virtual. Hopefully we will, everyone will be meeting in person soon enough when this is over, but definitely a lot to consider right now for that. And then our last topic was, I know we wanted to discuss the election. I saw this statistic that I thought was interesting and wanted to put in this PowerPoint that nearly 60% of municipalities across the state are experiencing that shortage of poll workers. So this definitely is a very timely issue, since the election is still moving forward, and municipalities are tasked with implementing that. The Wisconsin Elections Commission has provided some really helpful guidance regarding that, including public health guidance, and recommending that those over the age of 65 and those with any underlying conditions who are at more risk should not be working at the poll. Additionally, they have a list of many different questions to screen those workers before they even start working that day, you know, making sure that they don't have any contact with anyone who's known or suspected to have COVID-19, they have any fevers, coughs, difficulty breathing, body aches, you know, whether or not they're taking any medications to reduce a fever. As everyone knows, you know, this is a very contagious disease, and if anyone has any type of fever or any of those symptoms, they would be more likely to potentially spread that, and that's exactly what we're trying to avoid for those who are coming in to vote on April 7th. Poll site considerations. There's a lot of guidance right now on that website, which we'll have a link to, where it's providing some options for them, especially, you know, considering different signage to alert individuals who are coming in to vote that, you know, if you have those types of symptoms, you should not be entering the building. You would be putting a lot of individuals at risk, and that those who might have some of those symptoms listed here in that bullet point could potentially be offered curbside voting, and you know, to consider implementing that. And then also just for poll site considerations, keeping that proper hand washing, sanitation, and social distancing. And here's some of the practical advice that I had found on the website that really discusses how exactly are you supposed to social distance while you're a poll worker and while these individuals are coming in to vote. I've seen some municipalities start creating shields for workers where there's some type of plexiglass so that they're not actually within, you know, breathing distance away. Having, you know, tape being placed on the floor, measuring 6 feet apart between individuals, because to really emphasize that social distancing, you know, controlling those voting lines where, you know, you don't just have a line where people are, you know, shoulder to shoulder, making sure they're having that 6 feet of separation, and in really controlling the amount of people who are in the building to vote at that time. And then also looking at cleaning, you know, typically you just leave pens in the voting station, but right now, you know, how are they going to be handling multiple use of pens? Are pens going to be discarded after one use? Maybe considering using Clorox wipes to wipe them down, you know, disinfectant for workers who are looking at individuals' IDs, because that's a lot of hand-to-hand contact with that. Gloves for workers, proper hand washing and sanitizer, cleaning that equipment after each voter is passing through. You know, you're having those individuals sign the poll book, you're going back and forth with an ID, you're having that type of communication and interaction, and making sure that after every person that your poll workers are taking every precaution necessary to avoid contamination for them, and then for also those other individuals who have come in to vote. And then, as I alluded to before, curbside voting as a potential option. The Election Day Manual does provide the ability to do curbside voting for voters who typically, as a result of a disability, are unable to enter that polling place. They could receive that ballot at the entrance of the polling place, or they could even remain in their car to place their votes. Now, obviously, that could apply for those who are a little concerned about going into the building and don't feel that they can. So they can have those poll workers, look at that photo ID, have that voter complete the voter registration form, show proof of residence are necessary, and fill out that ballot while those individuals are still in their vehicle. That voter would be exempt from signing that poll book. But it's really important to remember that curbside voting cannot be the only voting option. Municipalities cannot decide to only implement curbside voting. And also consider that those extra safety precautions need to be taken for those poll workers, because they will be within that social distancing 6 feet if there would be that drive-through voting. And I think it's also important to hit that last bullet point of confidentiality here, because you still need to try to figure out how to make sure that those individuals are able to vote confidentially and go through this process still. So curbside voting is definitely an option for some individuals, but it can't be the only thing that is available as a method to vote. And we just kind of wanted to throw out a few other questions. I know we likely don't have time to go through all of them, but if you guys have any additional questions with them, obviously feel free to contact us. I don't know if Tony and Jim want to add anything on the election. I know I went through that pretty quickly, but I just wanted to touch on some of the main areas where we can provide a little bit of guidance for you guys.
No, at this point, I don't have anything to add. I see that we've already run our time. I know that you folks have our emails, and we would welcome any additional questions you have. We'll try to get back to you. Tony, I don't know, do you have any other things to add at this point?
No, I don't think so, Jim. Abby, good job on the election stuff. It's going to be really interesting to watch how, specifically on that topic, how everything shakes out over the next week or so.
Okay, well, I want to thank everybody for listening in, and feel welcome to call with any questions you might have. I note that most of you are on the call are current clients, so we'd be happy to discuss any issues or any other questions or anything that you would like clarified when you have the opportunity. Again, thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. With that, we will conclude this session. As mentioned earlier, we will share a recording and the PowerPoint with all of you after the program. Have a great afternoon.